Well, good evening. This is the third, as Chris Pastor Ullman said, in this series of Baptist history as it pertains to Canada, but really as it pertains to Ontario. That's been my focus and will continue to be our focus. In the next few weeks, we're going to look at theological education, the formation of a school called Canada Literary Institute in Montreal, and the work of a man named R.A. Fife, and the eventual formation of what we call McMaster University. But tonight, I'm going to look at one individual in particular, but along the way, touch on others. And it's a man named William Fraser, Fraser. And he's part of a large scale emigration from Scotland to this country, and will play a very, very important role in planting churches in the Ottawa Valley and then over at the foot of the Bruce Peninsula. And along the way, as we look at his life and ministry, and there's some very significant lessons that we can learn from his life and ministry. Along the way, I'm going to touch on the broader historical context as it was happening in this period of time. And next week, then, what that means then next week, because I'm going to be looking at the beginning of theological education among Baptists, we'll be actually looking back. Fraser's life covers from 1801. He was born in 1801. He dies in 1883. And so next week, we'll be coming back to the 1830s and so on. So there's a somewhat of an overlap in chronology. So William Fraser, I have a bit of a slideshow, which I will bring up in the chat feature. The screen, share screen. So this is William Fraser, and you should be able to see that. I think this is the only picture we have of him. It is actually a photograph. It's not a drawn artist rendition. That is a photograph taken probably in the 1870s, not long before his death, probably after he retired from Tifferton, where he ministered, and he retired from there in 1875 and went to live in Georgetown. So this is an actual photograph of Fraser in his latter years. I have a map to orient us, which I'll look at in a little bit, of Upper Canada, and we'll look at that in a little bit. So Fraser was born in 1801. He's born in the Scottish Highlands. He's a Highlander. He's Gaelic speaking. In the up until roughly the 1790s, Scotland was divided religiously. The lowlands were strongly Presbyterian, strongly Protestant, that is, then. The Highlands had never really been evangelized. The Gaelic-speaking populations of the Scottish Highlands, which is the northern half of Scotland, roughly, and the Hebrides Islands. They were primarily Gaelic-speaking. In the southern part of Ireland, they did speak English, but it's what's known as Scots English. So there would be terminology and an accent that would make it difficult for somebody, say, from southern England to understand them always. Britain, they're writing what we call English. But in the Scottish Highlands, you've got largely a Gaelic-speaking population, some of whom couldn't speak English at all, and their conversation would have been limited to the Gaelic tongue. Although there had been attempts to translate the Bible into Gaelic, there had been no really serious attempts to evangelize the Gaelic-speaking Scottish Highlands and Highlanders in the north. This had occasioned the fact that when there had been rebellions during the 18th century, fostered by a family known as the Stuarts, who had once been on the throne of England in the 1600s. And they tried to retake the throne 3 or 4 or 5 times, depending on how you figure it. The last major attempt being in 1745 and 1746 with a man named Bonnie Prince Charlie. Roman Catholic, supported by the French, who always took an opportunity to get a dig in at the English. And the French and the Scottish had a long-standing alliance in many respects. And Bonnie Prince Charlie was able to rally the Highlanders to his cause, not the Scottish Lowlanders, who are Presbyterian. He's Catholic. And in fact, he marched on England. He got pretty well, he probably was within 2 days of London when, for a number of reasons, some of which are obscure, he decided to go back to Scotland. It was a capital mistake. He could have taken the throne. Some of us who feel these things keenly, you might think this is bizarre, are glad he didn't take the throne. But he marches his army back to Scotland, and there is a battle, the final battle on English soil, called the Battle of Cludden, where the Scottish Highlanders basically face the English, but also they face their fellow Scotsmen, the Lowlanders. And the Highlanders are defeated in that battle, badly defeated. It's a rout, it's brutal. There's no quarter given for the wounded after the battle. And that begins the English attempt during the 18th century. This is important for our story, to destroy the clan system, which had been at the heart of the rebellion. The tartan is banned, bagpipes are banned, and teaching in Gaelic is banned. And England basically treats the Scots like a conquered colony. And for a lot of Scotsmen in the Highlands, there's no future. And so this will prompt them over the next 80 years or so, running through to the 1830s, in emigration. And in the 1820s alone, between 1815 and probably 1835, around 200,000 Scottish men and women will emigrate to Canada. A lot of them to Nova Scotia, but a lot of them to Ontario. And one of them will be our figure that we're looking at is William Fraser. For many of those people, they emigrate for economic reasons, the opportunity of land. For some of them, they're really fed up with the English rule, because England basically swallows up Scotland in many ways. The Scottish Parliament disappears and is basically taken down to London. And so for some of them, it's political. Probably one of the most famous figures that's political, and this is the larger background, is William Lyon Mackenzie. And those of you who did high school here in Ontario, I'm sure you would have taken something about him. At least the name should be familiar. And again, let me give you a snapshot of William Lyon Mackenzie. There's William Lyon Mackenzie. He was born 1795. He dies in 1861. He will emigrate to Canada because of the political and economic hardships in Scotland. Convinced he has no future in Scotland. He comes here in 1820 when he was 25. He comes with a very close friend named John Leslie. And Leslie will open a print shop in Toronto, what will become Toronto. I'll call it Toronto. It's still, to that point, it's called York. And he opens a second print shop in Dundas. And William Lyon Mackenzie will live in Dundas, probably a mile from where I'm living now, for about 2 years. And he has come to Canada to escape English domination, to have a better economic future. What he finds in Ontario is a partnership between a number of very wealthy English families some of whom are Scottish, like Sir Alan MacNab, and if you know McNabb Street in Hamilton, and the Anglican Church. It's known as the alliance is known as the Family Compact. And William Lyon Mackenzie will become deeply frustrated by this, and along with a number of other very liberal-minded, I'm thinking here liberal in terms of politics, liberal-minded individuals, he will be involved in the rebellion of 1837 and a small battle at Montgomery's Tavern. If you go along Dundas Street into Toronto, I've done it many times. Sometimes I used to have to drive into Toronto to teach at Toronto Baptist Seminary, and the traffic on the QEW was so atrocious. I'd actually go up to Highway 5 or Dundas Street, and at least it's moving, and you've got something to look at. And as along the way, you will hit Montgomery's Tavern. It's still there, where William Lyon Mackenzie in 1837 rallied a number of men, and they were going to seize the Ontario legislature. Shots were fired, and that was the end of the rebellion. And William Lyon Mackenzie fled to the United States. He hoped to rally American support to invade Canada, to create a republic, which he failed to do so. And finally, in the 1850s, he was given a pardon, and he came back to Canada. So there's all of this political stuff is going on in the background of the ministry of the man that we want to look at. William Fraser also comes to Canada, but he doesn't come for economic reasons, and he does not come for to escape English domination. He comes for the sake of the gospel. Born in the Scottish Highlands, he's fluent in Gaelic as well as fluent in English. He was Presbyterian, an unusual thing at that point in time, because most Highlanders were Catholic, but he was a Presbyterian. His family, though, was nominal. But around the age of 16, up until that point, he thought he was a Christian. He was given a Bible and sat under the preaching of a Scottish minister named Lachlan McIntosh. And it was under the preaching of this man that he was converted. And within a very brief period of time, became convinced of believer's baptism and was baptized as a believer. And by the time that he was 21 or so, he began to preach as an itinerant preacher. And for 2 years, he would trek around the Highlands, preaching the gospel wherever he got an opportunity, sometimes in barns, sometimes in the open air, sometimes in people's living rooms or kitchens. Not usually in churches. Catholics are not going to let him into their church, and Presbyterians wouldn't let him into their church either, because he was a Baptist. And this gave him a number of skills. Gave him, number one, a skill in communicating to people, whatever the context. You know, he'd come into towns and he'd have to preach, and he never often knew where he would be preaching. He also had to deal with hecklers, who often were Presbyterians. He'd come into some of the Scottish towns where there was a strong Presbyterian presence, and the elders of the Presbyterian church would find out he was there, and they'd turn out in full force to basically heckle him. And so he had to learn how to answer why he was a Baptist. And he became quite skilled as a debater. The other thing that this did for him, the Highlands are highlands. It's mountainous. And my wife, as probably many of you know, was Scottish, and her favorite topography, and I think your favorite kind of pastoral scenes are often shaped by what you see when you grow up, are the rugged Highlands. And the Highlands are wintry in, obviously, the winter months, deep snow. He would have to trek over these ranges. It gave him a physical stamina that would serve him well in Ontario. And during the winter months, he would have a 2-month circuit that he would take. Not maybe traveling 40, 50 miles from his home. In the winter months, in the summer months, he would be able to broaden that. He had kind of two little circuits of ministry that he would do, and he'd often return to the same villages and towns. And under his ministry, God used him to plant a number of churches in the Highlands. In 1826-27, he moves to the Hebrides on the Isle of Skye. I've never been to the Isle of Skye. It's one of my great desires to go there. It's very, very rugged, cold and windy, often at the best of times, even in the summer. You look at the topography, hardly any trees. And again, this would have given him a significant reserves of physical strength that he would need in Ontario. In 1831, he will emigrate. He'll be one of these 200,000 Scotsmen between 1835 and 1835 who will leave Scotland and emigrate to North America and to Canada in particular. In fact, a lot of the Scots, as they were waiting on wherever they were boarding a ship, there was a dance that they would dance called America, which obviously it actually was apparently quite the rage as these Gaelic-speaking Scots would emigrate. Now, let me move to Canada because I want to give you the context in which he emigrated. And I'll pick up that map that we had there. There's a map here of Upper Canada I want to look at. And so this is Upper Canada. I hope you can see it. I don't intend you to be able to read the very, very fine print. This is roughly around 1800, 1810. So it's a bit before our time, but it serves my purposes. So he is going to emigrate to this area here, Glengarry County, in the Ottawa Valley. This is the Ottawa River here. And he's going to be at a little village called Breadalbane, Breadalbane. And so Breadalbane then is way over here. It's kind of south and east of Ottawa, north and east of Cornwall, what is now Cornwall and Ottawa today. Ottawa at this point in time did not exist really as a large town. And the settlements in the Ottawa Valley were small and isolated, as we will see. And after the end of the Napoleonic War in 1815, which is also the end of the War of 1812, you remember that from 2 weeks ago, there were a number of Highland Scottish regiments. One of the ways in which the English dealt with young Highland men, just to make sure they weren't going to engage in another rebellion, is they said, why don't you join the British Army and see the world? And my following comments are not meant to be an attack on the English, but the English had a way of recruiting various people that they incorporated into their army, incorporated into their empire, into their army. And the Scots often were in the forefront of various battles that the English would fight during the 19th century. And a lot of them were Highlanders who they incorporated into the British Army. They would later do this with the Canadians and the Gurkhas. Interesting strategy, but that's a completely different story. So at the end of the 1812-1815 war, there was a number of Highland regiments, Scottish-speaking, Gaelic-speaking Highlanders. And the British said, we can take you back to the Highlands, but there's really nothing for you there. Or you can stay here in Ontario, what we call Ontario, Upper Canada, and we'll give you land. We'll give you land in the Ottawa Valley. And so a lot of them stayed, and some of them were Baptists. And so it was in 1816, a small church was planted at Breadalbane, Breadalbane. I'll put it in the chat feature there. one of the great privileges I did have was speaking at their 200th anniversary in 2016. There's Breadalbin in the, that's how you spell it. And I tried to find the place on a map. I got my, big map of Ontario. I couldn't, it's not even on there. It's near Dalkeith or Hawks. Is it Hawkesbury? I think it's Hawkesbury. Dalesville, Lachute, in that rough area. But it's not you have to really go onto a very, very detailed topographical map, because essentially it consists of, I think there's a little store and the church and a cemetery. And the church was formally organized with 2 elders. They're all Highlanders. They're all Gaelic speaking. All the services will be in Gaelic, and 13 members. In the formal organization was 1817, but the actual services begin in 1816. So there's some debate about, was it 1816, 1817? They celebrated the 200th anniversary in 2016, just when I was there. And it's an evangelical church. It's in the BCOQ. It's not in the fellowship, but they've had a series of evangelical pastors ever since William Fraser. By 1829, the membership was 60. That is, there were 60 men and women who had joined the church on the basis of believers' baptism, but they did not have a pastor. They didn't have a pastor for the first 15 years. Elders would preach. And in 1830, the congregation of Breadalbin found out that one of the Scottish ministers in the Ottawa Valley, a man named John Edwards, was planning a return trip to Scotland to try to recruit 2 or 3 Scottish pastors to come to Ontario to pastor a number of growing churches in the Ottawa Valley. And they said to him, "Could you please find us a man?" And so it was that John Edwards went to England and Scotland in 1831, and he convinced 2 men to come to Canada. One of them is John Gilmore. And I'll say a very little bit about him. He's actually probably, in some ways, more... William Fraser, hardly anybody knows him. John Gilmore, he's better known. But let me bring up a picture of him, and then I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's a friend of Fraser's, or would become a friend of Fraser's. And this is John Gilmore. And I apologize for the indistinctness of it. Again, this is a photograph taken in the 1860s. He had been born in 1792 and Scottish. Left home when he was 9 years old, joined the Merchant Marine, and was actually captured during the Napoleonic Wars, imprisoned in a French prison where he learned French fluently. He had no idea what this would mean. It was also in that prison he was converted. And at the end of he spent about 8 years in a French prison. And at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he was released, and he started pastoring in Aberdeen. And in 1831, he had gotten a little bit of advance notice, but John Edwards turned up at his house one morning in the middle of breakfast, and within minutes it said, would you be interested in coming to Canada? And when he was told that there was a large French population, he immediately decided to emigrate. He would come initially to Montreal. He would plant the first Baptist church in Montreal. He would be involved in, we'll see this involvement next week, he'll be involved very critically in planting the first seminary in Montreal, where they would teach, I'll talk about this next week, this is bizarre, they would teach Greek and Hebrew, which you need for the Bible, right? Latin, German for German scholarship, but they wouldn't teach French. It's very odd, very, very odd. Gilmore, though, was an evangelist. He evangelized the Quebecois. And then in the 1840s, late 1840s, he was called to Peterborough, and he would plant 2 or 3 churches in Peterborough. And one little sad little item on his biographical record, and I didn't know this until about 3 years ago, he was also involved in the very beginning stages of the residential schools. He was a land agent for the Crown dealing with some of the Indian reserves. And there is some evidence that he approved of what we would eventually know as the residential schools. He's very well known. The Gilmores become a major part of the old convention. There is a Gilmore Hall. If any of you have ever gone to McMaster, there's a Gilmore Hall. That's named after his grandson. And we'll actually talk about his grandson because it'll be the death of his grandson in 1925 that'll precipitate the great quarrel with liberal theology at McMaster. But that'll be a later talk. The other man who came with John Edwards was William Fraser. John Edwards went all the way up to Uig, U-I-G, on the Isle of Skye, where Fraser was living, and asked him if he'd be willing to come to Canada. And so it was in 1831, Fraser emigrated, and he went to Breadalbane. He became dissatisfied with his preaching within 2 or 3 years. Frustrated that while the church had grown, it wasn't growing under his ministry. He felt the people weren't listening to him. And he made 2 interesting decisions. One was he thought, maybe I need to leave Breadalbane, and he traveled all the way over to Lake Huron and down actually to Illinois, and to try to find maybe another place where he could minister. That trip was important because it gave him an idea about Lake Huron and the area of the north, the shore along from Kincardine all the way to the Bruce Peninsula. This is territory that there were very, very, very few European settlements there. The other thing that came out of this period of dissatisfaction, he went to see John Gilmore in Montreal, and Fraser was complaining about my preaching seems to be going nowhere. Maybe the Lord has saved all the people he's going to save in Breadalbane, he said to Gilmore. And Gilmore said to him, before there can be a blaze in the congregation, there must be fire in the pulpit. In other words, maybe you're the problem. Maybe it's not the congregation, maybe it's you. And this is what Fraser said about after that experience. And again, this is from this like little slide kind of presentation. So I hope you can read that. Fraser said, I betook myself to humiliation, prayer and fasting. And by solemn inquiry, was astonished to find how full the whole Bible made success depend on God's grace, but not as the antinomian would have it, and go to rest, but would have the true laborer go to work, depending on the master and his promise for success, as any farmer ever did in his own field and much more. How evident that God is the life and working power of all the great men of antiquity, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, and Joshua, David, Daniel, and all the prophets, and surely the apostles, under a far more favorable administration of the Spirit. Now, all this saving power and converting power of God's Spirit is placed in Christ Jesus as a granary for the supply of the life and labor of the church, and will be given to every sincere seeker. And surely his own faithful ministers will not seek it in vain, while they are eminently co-workers of God in the work of saving souls, a work which never is meant to be begun or carried on by mere human power. Now you'll notice those are his words. In other words, what he's saying there is that when God does a work in the life of his church and renews his church or revives his church, yes, the work comes from him, but he doesn't do it with God's servants sitting on their backsides and doing nothing. He needs to pray, he needs to fast, he needs to preach in the hope and confidence that God would work through the preaching of the word. Now you'll notice in the kind of my description of this, William Fraser in a state of mind preceding the 1834-1835 revival in the Ottawa Valley. One of the things that we sometimes fail to realize is that God has done great works in this province. And one that I've hardly ever heard anybody speak about this, the 1834-35 revival among 6 Baptist churches in the Ottawa Valley. Now, let me give you, by the way, some idea of what it was like to live in this area. Let me go back to this. This is a picture of Breadalbin in Glengarry. This was printed in 1836, and it looks like a carpet of forest in this area. And this little hut here, little hut down in the distance. An Englishman named Francis Augustus Cox visited this area in 1836, and he said, we had to beat our way for 14 miles through the bush. 1,400 might in some parts have been traveled with less difficulty and inconvenience. Bush is the Canadian term for the dense forest and tangled wilderness. And these are very isolated settlements. And travel is difficult. But in the winter of the fall and winter of 1834, 1835, all the way for about 18 months, somewhere in the vicinity of 350 to 500 individuals were converted. 350 added as members to these 6 churches. Fraser never experienced this again in his ministry, at least that sort of outpouring of the Spirit, where there were remarkable men and women, remarkable numbers of men and women converted. What I have failed to do, I just realized, is I should have tried to find out what exactly the population of this area was. It was a significant movement of God in this area of the Glengarry County that established at least half a dozen Baptist churches. And one of them that would eventually be established was in Ottawa, the First Baptist Church in Ottawa, which was built by Scottish Canadians. And in fact, one of our prime ministers, the second prime minister of Canada, was involved in that, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Let me read you 2 testimonies of conversion in this period. And again, let me go back to the share feature. These are 2 people who are converted, a young man and then a much older individual who was also a man. F.A. Cox, who had done I just quoted about working his way through the Canadian bush, records these 2 accounts. A youth said, Mr. Fraser was preaching and led me to see the evil of sin. I was overwhelmed with sorrow. As I went home I thought on the words of Christ, which I had heard, come unto me, all ye that labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I saw that Christ was able and willing to save, and I had nothing to do but to come to him and believe on him. Another stated he had lived 2 winters in a shanty, that is, and this is Cox's description, an inferior log hut made for temporary accommodation in the woods. Amidst abounding wickedness of every description, he had been conscious of some sense of religion, but was entirely withdrawn from it by bad company. In other words, he had spent his time in bad company, and that had prevented him from really giving any serious consideration to his spiritual state. When he came home to visit his mother now and then, he found that she and others went to worship, but he refused because he thought he was as good as they. Sometimes he met people on their return from worship, when one and another would speak a passing word about religion and mention where they had been. Still, he persisted for a long period, but at last he was persuaded to go. He continued, however, altogether unimpressed, not only indifferent, but hostile. But the thoughts of what had passed would occur to him in the woods, and one day he began to consider as he was working, what if I should die? What would then become of me? He tried to subdue the emotion and to get entirely rid of it, but it rose again in his mind. He reasoned and struggled and would not yield. Having by some means obtained a Bible, he threw it open carelessly in a kind of paroxysm produced by inward conflict. His eye fell upon the following words in Deuteronomy 27:15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. He then wished most earnestly that someone would kill him, that he might escape the misery which he felt. A Christian named Peter McFarland said, he, after this talk to me, and quoted that passage, "Who is a God like unto me, pardoning iniquity, which proved life to my soul." And those are two that come in that book by F.A. Cox, in which he describes two individuals whom he spoke to. He talked about, he arrives at the settlement of Breadalbane, the Church of Breadalbane, only a few months after the revival had kind of come to an end. But he said services, and Fraser would preach in Gaelic. They'd have a few minutes break, and then he'd preach the whole same thing in English. He had enormous stamina. He said you could hear a pin drop in the services. He said there was a sense of awe and the fear of God that pervaded the entire community after these revivals. This revival, the 1834-35 revival, is very, very important because it'll be the foundation of the conversion of a number of key figures in Ontario Baptist history in the 19th century, but we'll talk about them later. During the winter of 1835, a number of people had been converted, quite a number, and they wanted to be baptized. So what do? There's no indoor baptistry. Like, nobody's got indoor baptistries. So we'll go back to the share screen. And you baptize in the river. This is Cox again. Such is the zeal of these good people that nothing deters them from immediately professing religion when they feel it. And last winter, having made a natural baptistry by cutting through the ice, when the thermometer was 15 or 20 degrees below zero, 11 of them on a stormy day professed Christ by baptism. I spent quite a bit of time trying to find a picture. This obviously is not from that period. I found a lot of pictures of Russian Orthodox people getting baptized in the middle of winter in Russia, but I couldn't find, it took me a while. Anyway, eventually I found this, of a hole that somebody had cut in the ice, which kind of gave you a feel for what that would have been like. I mean, we've had minus 17. That's the weather. I mean, it's frigid. I can't imagine going out. And the people who got baptized, it's okay for them. Fraser would have to stand in the water, right, to baptize all 17. He doesn't have waders on. I mean, there is really a fortitude that these men and women had in their determination to follow Christ. By the 1840s, Fraser is beginning to sense that God is calling him to go elsewhere in ministry. And the government of Ontario has just opened up the Bruce Peninsula in the 1840s for settlement, English European settlement. And so Fraser makes a trip over to that area and tells his congregation regretfully that he feels God is calling him to go to the area now around Kincardine. And reluctantly, they agreed to part with their pastor. And so it is that Fraser moves in the late 1840s to Kincardine. He buys a house in Kincardine, tries to evangelize in that area, doesn't seem to have any success. And then he moves a little north to a little hamlet called Lorne, Lorne, where he builds another house and begins to evangelize. And God begins to own that ministry. It's very different from Breadalbane, though. Breadalbane, there was this outpouring of the Spirit of God in power with significant numbers of conversions. By the time that Fraser leaves Tifferton, which is where the church will be, I'll talk about that in a second, in 1875, there will be 354 members. but they've been added one by one by one by one. And God honored his ministry, but he never saw revival on the level that he saw in the Glengarry County again in his life. But yet still it was a remarkable work. He was he was a very large man and very imposing. And so he had about 5 miles to walk. He eventually moves to this little hamlet called Lyon, which is near Kincardine. And but he feels that he needs to plant a church in Tifferton. And so what he would do is on his way on Sunday morning, he'd start off about 7 a.m. The service would be around 11. And along the way, he'd pass all these farms, mostly with Scottish Gaelic-speaking Highlanders, because a lot of them had moved. And so he'd stop at the farms on the way. And he might get a cup of tea. And he'd tell the people, well, I'm on my way to preach at our service. You'll be coming with me, won't you? No, will you come with me? You'll be coming with me. And we're told that by the time that he eventually got to the church, he'd normally have about 30, 40 people trailing behind him who felt they couldn't refuse this very imposing, striking individual. That's not the only way he built his congregation, but it's one story that comes out from that period. Again, he'd be itinerant. Now remember his age. He's now in his 50s. And the strength and stamina he seemed to have didn't seem at all diminished. And eventually in 1867, they build a building, which is not the building that's there today. And let me give you the picture of this. This is a picture taken in the late 1800s. And that's Tifferton Baptist Church, 1867. It's not brick, it's clapboard. And if you go to Tifferton, it would have been right next to where Tifferton Cemetery is. I'm not sure what it was about Fraser that attracted my attention. It was about 20 years ago. And I spent, at least 2 or 3 afternoons just going through the cemetery. And what was amazing was how many of them were born in the Scottish Highlands. And it was obvious they were Gaelic speakers. And they had come to Canada probably in the 1820s, 1830s, and eventually ended up in this area, which we call Bruce County today. And again, he would preach in Gaelic, and then there would be a break, and then he would preach in English. By 1875, he's beginning to feel his age. He's 74. And his daughter, one of his daughters, Marianne, had married a minister named James Coutts, Coutts. And he was the pastor of a Baptist church in Georgetown. And so it was, he retired. His wife had died. He retired to Georgetown. And around 1880, he hears about Highlanders in Manitoba in the Red River area. And the CN train, the Canadian Pacific train had just opened up, the CP. And he decided to take the train out to preach. He's 80 years old. And he's going to go out to Manitoba to plant a church. And he gets out of Manitoba. He does some preaching, but it's too much for him. And it basically shatters his physical frame. And he comes back to Ontario to die in 1881. He's not a well-known pastor. He knew revival. He knew the necessity of hard work. He knew the vital importance of praying for your ministry. He knew the importance that he had to feel what he was preaching and know what he was preaching for God to own it and bless it. He labored in 2 places, Breadalbin, which is not even on the maps of Ontario, And Tiverton, which I know well because we used to vacation in Port Elgin, and we'd often drive down to Kincardine. These were the days when Port Elgin had very little by way of interest. And the big thing was going to a mall in Owen Sound that had air conditioning in the summer, or going down to Kincardine, which is a beautiful town. And you'd pass through Tiverton, and you came into Tiverton, and the highway. It's 25, I think it is. Is it 25, Graham? 26? 21. 21. You come into Tifferton, and it does a right angle and then another right angle. So you have to slow down. And so I'd see the Baptist church and then the cemetery. The Baptist church has moved onto the main highway now, and thought, wonder how that came to be here. And it was that kind of sparked my interest. And you'd be through the town in a few seconds. So William Fraser is not a well-known figure by any means, and yet he's typical. I could have chosen a number of pastors and their people in their congregations to illustrate the sort of men and women who built this province, who laid the foundations for our churches. The Fellowship Baptist churches, our churches were planted, the ones that go back to this period, by these sorts of people, and these are our roots. Men and women of remarkable courage and fortitude and character, not without their faults. One area that I haven't got into is Fraser had a tendency to sometimes get himself into controversies. When he was at Tifferton, he got into a big controversy with a neighboring Presbyterian minister, and they had a public debate about who was right about baptism. And so he's a bit feisty, but he's got a strength of character that I find quite winsome, and very important for us to understand what these men and women believed, and what God did through them in those days. Well, let me stop here. When I was getting ready for tonight, I thought I don't have enough material. I thought I'll be through this in half an hour. Well, anyway. Okay.